At first sight, many of you might ask the question, well, why should Marxists be discussing a question like art? Surely this is not essential. Surely it's not an essential part of the class struggle, or a part of the essence of what it is to be human. And this is a fundamental mistake, because art actually emerges together with our species, and as an integral and very important part of the whole psychology, the whole genetic makeup, if you like, of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Most people don't understand this, they don't realize it. But I want you to use perhaps a little bit of imagination. Try and go back, I know it's difficult, but make the effort. Try and imagine a situation, 60,000 years ago, at the time of what is known as the Paleolithic period, the Old Stone Age, as it used to be called, in which people were habitually described as cave dwellers. Actually, that's not accurate. There's no proof that people actually lived in caves, at least on a permanent basis. If they were after all hunter-gatherers, they'd be traveling around in huts of a temporary character. At certain times, yes, they would perhaps dwell in a cave, but it would be the outer part of the cave where we had light and air and so on. But I want you to imagine the situation not in that part of the cave, which was inhabited, but the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the cave, shrouded in utter darkness, in blackness. No light, no air, no life apparently. And yet, into this darkness, something begins to move. Something crawling on its belly into this pitch black darkness. And now, if you put shine a light on this darkness, you find something very strange. You know what you find? You find the imprint of a hand. Okay? The imprint of a hand, of a human hand. Whether it's the hand of a man or a woman, who can say? We don't know. Obviously, for the person that made that imprint on the cave wall, this was a transcendental moment. Nobody does that kind of thing lightly. It must have cost a tremendous effort. Imagine the struggle, the effort, the danger that this journey, this long, arduous, painful journey involved. And there, in the flickering light, the only light that would be available would be maybe some primitive lamp of animal fat. On this same wall, you find art. Beautiful art, in the case of, particularly in Europe, in the case of Lascaux and Altamira in Spain, wonderful depictions of animals, of bison, of other wild creatures, described with colossal anatomical detail by people who clearly knew these animals, very intimate. One thing you can be absolutely certain of, no matter what this art was, no matter what it represented, and we can't be sure of this, nobody can be sure what this art really represents, you can't get back into the mindset of those men and women. And yet, one thing is absolutely abundantly clear. This art was necessary. It was not something frivolous. It was not something that you could ignore. It was not something, it was something considered by all of these people to be an essential importance, essential part of their nature, of their social being, of their soul, if you like to use that expression. Okay? To this man or woman that imprinted their hand, it's as if he's saying, of course, this as an individual, I am here. Here I am. I have arrived. Yes, But it's not just the individual that's arrived. It's the human species, our species, declaring to the universe, I have arrived. We have arrived. Human beings have arrived. And from that instant, the entire future of the planet was transformed. Now think about it. This is very interesting. From a Marxist point of view, the hand. Engels wrote a marvelous little pamphlet, which you haven't read it. You should read it. It's very important. And by the way, modern science has proven that this theory was correct, where Engels explained it wasn't the brain that was the motor force of human progress. It was the hand. The human hand and human labor, which created the brain. That's the absolute profundity of the correctness of materialism as against idealism. That's been shown to be correct. Yes, it's the hand, human labor, which has transformed the world, proceeding from the most primitive stone tools. And by the way, we call them primitive. They weren't primitive at all. Even the earliest stone tools took a colossal effort to develop. It wasn't. You had to have a really skilled approach. You and I couldn't create these tools now. If you were given the rocks to bang together, you'd never get the result. These people did get results. And from these early stone tools to rockets capable of landing on Mars, that's the gigantic leap that human creativity, human labor, manual labor, has been responsible for. Now, surely this bears serious thought, something you have to think about. What does it mean? Now, the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God was the Word. But Goethe, the German poet, answered, he said, no. Am Anfang war die Tat. In the beginning was the deed, not the word, although the Bible's partly right. The development of language obviously played a huge role in human evolution. It's one of the things which distinguishes us from animals. I know it's not fashionable to say that now. These postmodernist imbeciles who pass for professors at the universities, God knows why, and write stupid books, again, God knows why. But in any case, they struggle to say, oh, no, there's no fundamental difference, between humans and animals. The same thing, there's no such thing as progress in history, if you please, okay? Every society is the same as every other society. Every art is the same as every other art. Every culture is the same as every other culture. There's no change, there's no development. Okay? It was absolute nonsense. Absolute arrant nonsense. And of course, there isn't really even a real difference between humans and animals. Well, if you tell me that we humans are basically animals, I would agree. So we are. Yes, but we're not just any animals. Oh no. It's true. Genetically speaking, the genetic difference between ourselves and our nearest relatives, which are the bonobo chimpanzees, is less than 2%. Less than 2% separates us from the apes. Yes, but dialectically speaking, this is a qualitative leap. That less than 2% is decisive. And nobody can tell me that a bonobo chimpanzee is capable of developing the theory of relativity or launching a rocket ship to Mars. I think they'd find some difficulty. Some people say, one of the theories which is based on a philosophical mistake, if you give a monkey a typewriter and infinite time, eventually he'll produce the collected works of Shakespeare. I'm here to tell you, I'm very sad to say this. You give a monkey a typewriter and give him infinite time, with difficulty he might produce something resembling one sentence. Maybe. And that's a big maybe, It's absolute gibberish of the worst sort. Oh, no. And you see, what is true, yes, it's true, the elements of language can be found in other species. Whales, for example, they've made huge discoveries. The language of whales, they communicate over a long distance. Very interesting, yes. And even the most primitive beings have some kind of communication elements with them. So you could say, yeah, and even an aesthetic element, you could say, well, what about the bowerbird that creates these fancy nests and so on? Yes, we know that this is instinct, and it's very a narrow instinct for narrow purposes, mainly for reproduction, for attracting the other species, you know, so show how smart and handsome they are. Same as our males go around trying to show how handsome and smart they are by dressing up on a Saturday night to go to the discotheque. But there we are. It's usually a miserable failure, by the way. But in any case, to go back to what I was saying, yes, the elements exist. But you see, as it's one thing to have the element, which is the potential for further development. It's another thing to actually achieve future development, further development, in the evolutionary sense. You know, Hegel, that giant, philosophical giant, he wrote in the Phenomenology of Mind, he said, when we want to see an oak tree with its solid trunk and its mass of green foliage, we are not satisfied to be shown an acorn instead. Although the acorn, of course, is true. It is an oak tree in potential, but it's not yet an oak tree by any manner of means. And therefore, this is what you must understand. The potential was there from the very early beginnings. All that we've achieved, the potential was always there, based on one thing. This magnificent instrument, the human manual labor. Now then, this was the case for thousands and thousands of years of slow evolutionary development. There suddenly was a great leap forward. It was the greatest revolution in human history, actually, which Gordon Childe, the Australian, he was the discovery of modern archaeology, actually, an Australian. He was also a Marxist, which people don't know. A brilliant writer, 2 books which you must read. One is called What Happened in History. The other is called Man Makes Himself. Marvelous books, Marxist books explaining human development. And he coined the phrase, he invented the phrase, the Neolithic Revolution. That is the transition, very important transition, from early hunter-gathering society to settled agriculture. Agriculture, settled communities, the first cities, and so on. And this represented a colossal development, first of all, of the productive forces, based upon the massive application of human labor, by the way, the collective application, the planned application of human labor on a far bigger scale than was ever considered before. And of course, as a result of that, the development of art and culture. Now then, this was a genuine cultural revolution. Culture, if you like, in the modern sense, that was born at that time. And there was a fundamental transformation, a transformation of everything. Every change in the productive forces and productive relationships, which is what we're talking about here, because here, by the way, for the first time you have private property of the means of production. Didn't exist before. There was no private property of the means of production in the Stone Age. But in the Neolithic period there was. The first divisions between rich and poor, those who possessed and those who did not possess land. That was the point, the possession of land. And therefore, you have the beginnings of the state, of inequality. You have the beginnings of the inequality of men and women, the enslavement of women. Okay? And you have the first great alienation. It was a colossal step forward, yes, of course. It meant a colossal development of culture and ideas and science, yes, of course, and technology. The pyramids and all the rest of it, yeah, sure. It was also, from the standpoint of the great majority of humanity, a colossal step backwards. Because for the first time, men and women were alienated from themselves. They lost property. They lost control over their lives. They lost freedom. They lost their soul. Oh yes, for the first time you have organized religion. You didn't have that before. The so-called primitive people of the Stone Age didn't have organized religion, or if it was collective. Everyone participated in the rituals and dancing and singing, all part of religion, by the way. No, you get a priest caste. The invention of writing was a big step forward in that sense, yes. But it was also a weapon of enslavement. You had this privileged caste of priests, of mandarins, as they say in China, who had sole possession, a monopoly of culture. Now, think about it. That is the root of all of human development for the last 10 or 12,000 years, what we call civilization. Western civilization is based on what? On the division of mental and manual labor. And for the first time, mental labor becomes elevated, and manual worker becomes oppressed and downgraded and humiliated and reduced to nothing. Okay? And that's been the basis of society ever since. Now, this had a colossal progressive significance. Now, Aristotle was one of the great philosophers. You see, there were great philosophers in the past, which unfortunately I don't think they teach at the universities anymore. They're far too busy discussing this fly shit known as, what's it called?
Postmodernism.
Postmodernism, that's right. It's such a lot of insignificant crap, I can't even remember what it's called. This drivel, which is fed to the unfortunate students of philosophy. How many of you study philosophy? Put your hands up. How many philosophy students are there? 1, 2, 3. What courageous people. There must be more. There must be more, but they're ashamed to admit it. I'm not surprised. They're ashamed to admit it. Yeah, so would I be. I bet you went into the university with all bushy-eyed and keen and interested in philosophy, what these great ideas are. I bet you were soon bitterly disappointed, weren't you? Silence as of the grave. Yeah, sure. You learn nothing from it. But I don't wish to speak disrespectfully about philosophy. Philosophy is a wonderful thing. If you take the trouble to study philosophy. I took the trouble of writing a book about that not so long ago. I'm busy writing another one at the moment. That's another story. That's a secret. People say, what's happening about the book? I said, well, it's a theoretical book. What do you mean? Well, it's got a theoretical existence, but that usually shuts them up okay. Philosophy is a wonderful thing. And these great giants of thought, all of the Greeks were geniuses. Aristotle was a particular genius. And he said the following. Many years before Marx, 1,500 years before Karl Marx, he wrote the following in his book, The Metaphysics. Man begins to philosophize. That's to say, to think about great things, have big ideas. I try to understand the universe and so on. Man begins to philosophize. He didn't refer to women because women were not together, same as slaves. But what he meant was the human race. But he said man's, well, just quote him. Man begins to philosophize when the necessities of life are provided. Very true. And he goes on to say, consequently, mathematics, and geometry, and astronomy were discovered in Egypt because the priests did not have to work. Now then, there you have the secret of all human development for 10,000 years. Fundamental truth. Of course, in the case of Greece, they say Greece was a wonderful democracy, Athens in particular, wonderful. At a certain stage that was true, as a result of a revolution, by the way, or a series of revolutions. But in any case, it was democratic, yes, it was wonderful democracy for the few that were free. But for the majority of society, they were not free. The slaves had no rights whatsoever. Women had no rights whatsoever. Foreigners had no rights whatsoever. So it was a minority of privileged free citizens that had all the power, all the rights. Yes, and of course nowadays you can look back and say, well, it's a terrible thing because of slavery and so on. How can you praise the Greeks because didn't they have slaves? And the Romans had slaves. So they did. The same as the capitalists today have slaves called wage slaves. Formally they're different, but in practice they're not that different. The Romans used to refer to slaves as instrumentum vocalis, a tool with a voice. Don't the capitalists see the workers like that? I think they do. Not as human beings at all. A tool with a voice, a means of producing surplus value. That's all. Yes, but think about it. Without slavery, without this terrible position of the exploitation of the majority by a small minority, human culture could not have developed. That's a fact. Hegel once wrote, it's not so much from slavery as through slavery that man becomes free. That's true, as a matter of fact, if you look at history. Now, from a Marxist point of view, you cannot approach history from a moralistic point of view. That's a big mistake. Stupid mistake. No point in that. No. Can't interpret history in terms of modern morality. It doesn't work. Okay? But you have to approach it from a scientific point of view of historical materialism, Marxism, which explains all of human culture, science, art, everything else, ultimately depends on one thing, and that's precisely manual labor. Precisely the exploitation, precisely the slavery of the majority produces culture. And therefore, that was a necessary stage in human development. Now, this Neolithic revolution had a big effect on art. All changes are reflected in culture and in art, one way or the other. That's as night follows day. For the first time you had organized religion, you had a priest caste. Art itself was in the hands of this caste. In Egypt, for example. It's quite clear. If you take a stroll down the road here, you're next to one of the great museums in the world, the British Museum, you go to the Egyptian department, and you'll find this remnants of a big statue of one of the pharaohs. I think it was Ramesses II, I'm not sure. Find out. The arm of this statue is probably almost as big as my whole body. Vast, huge statue. And this statue, thousands of years later, actually speaks to us. Oh yes, it has a voice, it has a message, and the message is this: I am big, you are small. I am mighty, you are powerless. I am great, you are nothing. You are my slave. That's what this message, what this is telling us. It's class art. And for the first time, I must emphasize that you must understand this, humanity was dispossessed of its soul, dispossessed of culture, removed from culture. Culture now becomes the monopoly of a privileged caste. And as Engels pointed out, any society in which, he wrote, in which art, science, and government are the property of a few, that few will use and abuse its position in its own interest. Culture is power. Oh, yes. And therefore, those people who think they're Marxists, say, well, we can ignore culture, it's nothing to do with us, are being extremely stupid and completely ignorant of the facts of history and the basic essence of Marxism itself, which makes me somewhat impatient on times. Anyway, eventually the slave society collapsed. You had the barbarian invasions. Oh yes, in come our postmodernist friends. Oh no, the barbarians, they weren't so bad really, you know. And they were perhaps better than the Romans, because look, the Romans had slavery and so on. The barbarians were much nicer type. The Vikings, for example. Any comments here from Sweden or Norway? Put your hand up. Any Vikings present? They're afraid to put their hand up again, you know. Of course, the Vikings got a very bad press, didn't they? You know, they became burning and killing and massacring and raping and enslaving people. No. Yes, but they had very cute ornaments and nice trinkets. And look at the jewelry. Look, they had culture. Look, they had yes, they had a culture, a barbarian culture, of course. They also had nice swords. Look at the way their swords are produced, you know. They're sharp. You could shave yourself with one of these. Yes, you can also cut a man and woman in half with your swords, which was their purpose, after all. Absolute drivel. The Dark Ages, no Dark Ages. It was really quite a nice period to live in. Yes, you just try it. You just try it. I'd like to send them back to the Dark Ages, see how they get on with it. See how they get on with it, yeah. The Dark Ages are called for a reason. The whole of human culture collapsed. You see, there is such a thing as progress in history. There's also such a thing as regression in history. And this was a colossal regression, for goodness sake. I'll just quote one instance. It comes to mind. 1,000 years after the collapse of Rome, the only half-decent roads in Europe were Roman roads. The rest were mud tracks. They lost the art of road building, of bridge building, of everything. And culture now becomes concentrated into the hands of a new priest caste of the church, the Catholic Church, if you like. Well, an absolute crushing domination over art and culture. There's no art to speak of other than religious art in the narrowest sense of the word. Yes, but even in this cultural desert, well, they tried to make out, oh no, it's not so bad. They really had a wonderful culture of the Middle Ages. Well, personally, I don't share that view at all, but there we are. Each to his own taste. But you see, within this cultural desert, there were the beginnings of the green shoots. It always happens, you know, even in the most desert conditions. New life comes through. In the cities, the towns and cities began to revive. Trade began to revive. And you had, of course, the rise of the bourgeoisie, a new revolutionary class, the bourgeoisie, starting in the north of Italy and in the Netherlands, in Holland, in Flanders in particular. There were elements of this in art. For the first time, the Virgin and Child. For the first time, the Virgin seemed to be like a real woman, feeding a real baby out of a real breast. This was unheard of previously. And this new art, it was the beginning of a phenomenon which we call the Renaissance, the rebirth. In French, is the Renaissance. And in the religious sphere, get a load of this, the first great battles, revolutionary battles of the bourgeoisie against the old feudal order were against religion. They were fought in the cultural sphere, in the sphere of ideas, if you like, with this revolt, the growing revolt against the monopoly, the tyranny of the church, which became completely discredited. Actually, towards the end, they tried to present that, the Middle Ages people were very religious. They believed they believed in God. They believed in the devil too, which is more important. They were afraid to go into hell if they went against the priest. But the priests were hated, to the extent there was a Catholic author, Catholic historian I read, who said that at the end of the Middle Ages, the battle cry went up, which was very popular, death to the priests. Oh yes, hardly a very religious idea. Out of this ferment there comes a man called, a monk actually, called Martin Luther in Germany, who starts a religious revolution in the form of the Protestant revolution. I won't go into the details. That was a revolution. And Luther actually played a big role in the revolutionizing of the invention, in effect, of the German language, the modern German language. He translated the Bible into German. This was a crime, by the way. Yeah. At the time, there was the revolt of the Netherlands. By the way, people think that the first bourgeois revolution was in England. It wasn't. The first bourgeois revolution was in Holland, was in the Netherlands. It took the form of a revolt of the Netherlands against Spanish rule. They were under the control of Catholic Spain. Very brutal affair, very bloody affair. At one time, Philip II of Spain actually condemned the entire population of Holland to death, with exceptions. Oh yes, and of course the Inquisition was very active, and Protestants were tortured and killed and murdered and burnt alive and so on. The usual cute practices which you'd expect from a Christian outfit. Oh yes, and of course, if a man were to confess his sins, renounce Protestantism, accept the church, then the church would be merciful, and he would be hanged would be beheaded instead of being burnt, which is very nice. And women, of course, if they confessed their sins and returned to the bosom of the church, they were also merciful. Instead of being burnt alive, they were buried alive. That's nice, isn't it? This was, and by the way, at that time, I come back to the Bible, it was a capital offense in the Netherlands to have a Bible in your house. Oh yes. If you were caught with a Bible in your house, you were executed. Yeah. The Bible was a very revolutionary document. You read the Bible. How many of you read the Bible? Put your hand up. Oh, I see. And the rest of you are pagans. Terrible. You should read the Bible. It's a good book. I read the Bible. I've read all of it. It's a very interesting book full of wonderful philosophy and poetry and ideas and so on. I was a bit disappointed by the end. That's the thing. You know, the world going up in flames, I didn't fancy that very much, but there we are. Anyway, but the Bible, they were very cute about it, the priests. They didn't prohibit the Bible, although it's full of revolutionary stuff. You'd be surprised. You know, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God, etc. I won't go to I could quote this all day long. I haven't got time. Oh, it's Sunday today, isn't it? Yeah, perhaps I should, but I haven't got time. Maybe another time when I speak about religion. But yes, so it was in Latin, which nobody could read except for the priests and the educated classes. The masses couldn't read the Bible. They turned up to church and the priest would, you must believe this. This is what the Bible says. This is what God says. This is what I say. Believe it or else you'll go to hell. Then along comes Luther and translates the Bible into German. A man in this country, in Britain, Wycliffe, translated it before that into English. And this was a real... People for the first time could read what the Bible says. And there's some very revolutionary stuff you don't understand. Very revolutionary stuff in the Bible, if you read it carefully. So therefore, this is the beginning of the Reformation, which was a revolution. Luther actually wrote a number of hymns. One of which is called Ein feste Burg. Perhaps the Germans would know this. Very fine hymn, which Engels described as the Marseillaise of the 15th century, of the 16th century, rather. It was a revolutionary movement. Now, fast forward. I said the first revolution was in Holland. The Dutch rose up against Spanish and Catholic rule, and they succeeded after a hard struggle of many decades. And a new bourgeois republic was born for the first time in the world in Holland, the Dutch Republic, which at that time was, of course it wasn't perfect, but it was definitely the freest country in Europe where ideas could more or less freely be expressed and so on. And this was reflected in art. A tremendous blossoming of art. It already existed early in the Renaissance in Italy, of course, and Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and people like that. And in the Netherlands, in Flemish art, of course. But here it was an entirely different kettle of fish. Dutch art. You can see this again if you go to the National Gallery, which I recommend. Fantastic. A man like Rembrandt. What a wonderful painter. And by the way, Rembrandt was the son of a miller. He was from the working class. This is unknown of in any other country. And therefore, this represented, again, a colossal step forward in human culture, which is important. You have the English Revolution. Well, culture didn't play such a role, but it did play a role. You get the great English poet Milton, wrote the great poem, Paradise Lost. Milton was a revolutionary. He was a minister in Cromwell's revolutionary government. How he escaped with his life? Well, because he was famous. Otherwise, he'd have been bumped off. But we'll have to skip things again. We come now to the 18th century, the greatest bourgeois revolution. Here I'm trying to establish a relationship, a link between art and revolution, because there is a link. The French Revolution was the greatest liberation, emancipatory event in human history. It was tremendous. You can't imagine the effect of that revolution. Actually, the best person who expressed it best, perhaps, was the great English poet William Wordsworth, who visited revolutionary France in 1792, made a profound impression upon him. He's only a young man. And he wrote a famous long poem called The Prelude, in which he wrote the following marvelous words, describing the impact of the French Revolution, which you can't understand. He wrote the following: bliss 'twas in that dawn to be alive. Bliss is joy, rapture. Bliss 'twas in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Now that's poetry. For those of you that don't think you don't like poetry, I advise you to reconsider that. This poetry begins where ordinary language ends. And I think music begins where poetry ends. It carries our spirit, our emotions, to an entirely different level. There are many examples I could give. The French Revolution had a colossal effect all over Europe. It had an effect in music, particularly the young German composer Ludwig van Beethoven, the Probably definitely one of the greatest composers that ever lived. A man that was responsible for a musical revolution. Listen to his Fifth Symphony. You don't know the Fifth Symphony? Everyone knows the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Its opening bars, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, and so on. You know, this is not a symphony. This is the French Revolution in music. Listen to it. Listen to it from start to finish. And Beethoven was a revolutionary, a conscious revolutionary. I've written at length about this. You can see what I wrote. And he remained a revolutionary all his life, a conscious revolutionary. There were many others. The Scottish poet Rabbie Burns, what a marvel. And he was again a revolutionary, persecuted by the social order and so on. But you see, here's a relationship. And in Spain, for example, you have a really mighty artist of those times, Francisco Goya. Now, if you ever go to Madrid, make a point of going to the Prado Museum and have a look at Goya's paintings. Wonderful paintings, wonderful paintings. The early Goya, and it's as if they're written by two different artists. The early paintings are full of colour, blue skies, happy people, happy youngsters playing around and so on, playing games and flirting with each other and so on. The early Goya. And the later Goya, what's known as the Black Period. Spain was invaded by Napoleonic France, and a terrible war ensued, which destroyed society. Goya produced a series of etchings, black and white etchings, called The Disasters of War, Los Desastres de la Guerra. If you want to see the horrors of war accurately conveyed, you look at those etchings of Goya. You'll find them on the internet, no doubt. The Disasters of War. And his black period at the end of his life, which, by the way, he didn't intend anyone to see these paintings. They were painted on a wall in a little hut, I think in France. How they survived and were taken to Madrid, I don't know. Anyway, they are black. They are black. Here's a picture of a gigantic wave. It's the color of vomit. Okay, that's all. And this wave, the only sign of life, is a dog's head just preventing itself from being drowned in this sea of vomit. There are pictures of the Inquisition, all the horrors of the Inquisition. Pictures of witches, of demons, of devils of all sorts. This is the dark night. Prior to that, by the way, he witnessed a terrible atrocity committed by the French in Madrid, where there was an insurrection on the 2nd of May. It's still celebrated in Madrid. Heroic uprising, which was brutally suppressed. And he wrote 2 paintings describing the events of the 2nd of May. You should see these paintings. First, this describes this desperate struggle against semi-unarmed people against armed, trained professional soldiers. And the second one, the night of the 2nd of May, shows the terrible reprisals inflicted by the French against the Spaniards. Black, complete darkness. You see the pictures of the soldier. The firing squad has got its back to you. You don't see their faces. It's like a horrible machine. Not men at all. Shooting these civilians dead. And in the middle of these soldiers, a sea of blood on the floor. You can taste the blood that's on the floor. And in the middle there's a man in a white shirt against this black background with his arms up like a crucified Christ being shot down by these soldiers. Here is a voice of real art. Art which takes its starting point on the realities of humanity, which expresses these realities, and which expresses the rage and indignation of a true human being and a great artist. Now, there are other examples. I once, quite near to here, I was invited to speak at the Whitechapel Gallery. They had a huge reproduction, it was a tapestry actually, of a famous painting by Pablo Picasso of the Spanish Civil War, terrible struggle of the Spanish people against fascism. And in that, there was a terrible event in 1938, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps I got the date wrong, but memory's not too good these days. There was a little market Basque town called Guernica. And on market day, when the market was full of civilians buying and selling their goods and so on, the German Air Force was sent, because Hitler was supporting Franco. They dropped firebombs they completely destroyed the place, massacring men, women, and children without mercy. Pablo Picasso was in Paris at the time, and he furiously got to work, produced this huge painting, which again, if there's anything that comes close to Goya's paintings, it's this. You must have seen Guernica, it's been reproduced 1,000 times. Yes, but you haven't looked at it properly, I don't think. It's even on T-shirts and things like that, which is reprehensible to treat a great work of art like that. Okay? Here, it's a black and white painting. Picasso knew how to use colour, of course. Black and white. And it's like a dark room, but there's a light bulb on, a light bulb. It's not a cheerful light, it's the light which you expect to find in a police torture chamber or something like that. There are all kinds of horrors. There's a woman with a baby in her arms, weeping. The baby is dead, obviously. There's warriors on the ground with broken swords. There's a raging bull, like the bull in the bullfights. Pablo Picasso used to go to the bullfights in Spain. A raging bull, which is the bull of fascism. There's a horse which is pierced by a lance, which you also find in the bullfight, and which is screaming. The whole painting is screaming, and yet it's a silent scream, like the scream that you have in a nightmare. It's a nightmarish portrayal of war. I'll tell you a little story about this. The story, I don't know if it's true, I think it may be true. In 1940, I think it was, when the Germans entered Paris, a German officer turned up at Pablo Picasso's art studio and he saw this painting. And he turned to him and he said, "Did you do this?" He said, "No, I didn't do that. You did that." That was the answer. Pablo Picasso joined the Communist Party, by the way, and became a communist. He declared publicly, declared his loyalty to communism. Now look, this is genuine art, my friends. Okay? And you find the same thing in that greatest of all revolutions, the Russian Revolution, which is generally, it's always predicted, it's described by all the bourgeois enemies, all these people, so-called historians, liars, every single one of them. Dreadful, cynical bastards, liars, cheats, frauds. Present the Russian Revolution as a sea of blood, of bloody tyrants, of tyranny, of oppression. Nothing of the sort. I have reason to firmly believe, not just from the books, but even from my own experience, which I will relate, that this Russian Revolution was the greatest liberation event in history, comparable or greater than the French Revolution. And it led millions of people. This is the point you must understand. You think revolution is just a question of fighting for bread? It is not. To go back to the Bible, since it's Sunday, Bible says, "Man shall not live by bread alone." Very true. Very true. You think socialism, you think communism is just a question of reducing working hours? Well, that's very important, of course. Of full employment, of housing and health and everything that you guys are constantly on about in agitation. It's a bit more than that, you know. It's a lot more than that. If that's your vision of communism, then we disagree. That's a very trivial, superficial, empty vision, anemic vision of communism. These things, full employment, raising living standards, yeah, very important as a basis, but only the basis, only the start, only the acorn, only the potential, the true potential. What communism really represents is a revolt against that great injustice that was committed 12,000 years ago, with the degradation of manual labor in favor of intellectual labor and the exclusion of the masses from culture. The conquest of culture is not a secondary question, for God's sake. The conquest of culture by the masses is not the fairy on the Christmas tree, and the masses understand this. If there's one thing that really annoys you, want to really annoy me, You know, I'm a very peaceful man, really. My colleagues on the IS sometimes find that hard to believe, but they're very unjust. I'm a peaceful sort of man. It takes a lot to anger me. You want to really anger me? You tell me that the workers are not interested in culture, that art is not for the workers. That, you know what that shows me? It doesn't show me that you've got a proletarian mentality. It shows that you're a rotten petty bourgeois, snob, with not the slightest understanding of the working class or the way that they think and feel. That's a fact. I speak from experience, I know. It's not the case. And in every strike, a strike is a revolution in miniature, okay? In every strike, you speak to anyone that's participated, there are great surprises. People that you thought were backward, were ignorant, had no interest in politics and so on, wouldn't even turn up to a trade union branch. Once a strike begins, they participate. And they begin to understand. You know what they begin to understand? It isn't just a question of the wages. That's important, but it's not the fundamental thing. They begin to feel the power of their class. They begin to feel part of that power. And they begin to feel, I am not a slave. I am a conscious, fighting human being, fighting for my freedom and my emancipation. And at that moment, you know what that is? This man or woman, women in particular, is applicable, rise above themselves, far above themselves. They discover within themselves desires and aspirations they didn't even know that were there, because they've been crushed out of them by this merciless, inhuman capitalist system. But it's there. And nothing can destroy that. Nothing can destroy it. I said that I had some personal experience. I will tell you with permission. When I was studying in Moscow University, this was in 1970, that's a long time ago, I met an old lady, an old woman, that had been a member of the Bolshevik Party in 1917. This woman was sentenced by Stalin to 14 years in one of those terrible labor camps in Siberia. How she survived, I don't know, but she did. She wouldn't talk about that. But one day, I asked her, I can't even remember her name, I'm sorry to say, such a long time ago. I said, what was it like in the October Revolution? I remember her old face. She's a very old woman, a wrinkled, oppressed, depressed old person. Suddenly, it's as if the wrinkles disappeared, and her eyes, really, they began to shine. They began to, really. I'll never forget. And I'll never forget the tone of her voice. It was transformed. It was a young voice. She says, you can't imagine what it was like. You can't imagine. She said a Russian expression, kakoi padjom. Now, I find that difficult to translate. Padjom in Russian means uplift. More than that, it implies a kind of spiritual uplift. A spiritual uplift of millions of people, of millions of workers who suddenly begin to think, we are not slaves, we're not oppressed people, we are human beings with a desire to advance, to understand, to learn, to batter down the barriers which prevent us from having access to culture. The Bolshoi theatre at that time was full of grey overcoats of soldiers from the trenches and workers from the factories. For the first time, with their mouths open, listening to this music which they'd never heard before, experiencing experiences which they never thought they would. This is what a revolution means, my friend. Not just a penny off on the pay or a half an hour off the worker. That's not it. That's not it at all. In a real revolution, you precisely get this enormous wave of passion, of emotion. That is what propels people to fight. That's what gives them an illusion, an idea, a dream, which is no longer a dream, but a reality which they must fight for. If you don't understand that, my friends, you haven't begun to understand what it is we are fighting for. Now, to come back to the essential point. For 12,000 years, the great majority of mankind have precisely been reduced to the role of slaves, a tool with a voice, a nonentity, a nothing, a number, something empty. Now that's not the real working class, my friends. It is not. It is not. And a revolution has that role of bringing millions of people. By the way, we're not like the stupid bourgeois liberals that regard workers as ignorant little children, not capable of understanding anything. We don't have that attitude. We don't pity them because they're poor, oppressed people. That's the idea of snivering liberals. The Friends of the United Nations in Oxfam and stuff like that. No. We consider the working class to be the only genuine creative class in society. Right? Okay. A creative class. And that's a fact. And this creativity will be reborn once they get on the road. It takes time. It will not be easy, not automatic, but it will come as night follows day. And this marvelous conception, this marvelous idea, which is communism, will be reborn on a far higher level than we've ever seen before. Now, this is something I hope. I haven't had time. I've got to finish now because my time, unfortunately, is exhausted. Perhaps I might go into writing on this question if I have time later on, after the philosophy book, maybe. But in any case, if I've done no more than to cause interest in your minds, and by the way, we ourselves, every one of you, have got a duty, a revolutionary duty, not just to conquer the ideas of Marxism, of ideas of economics, of philosophy, but also to conquer culture, to acquire a genuine interest in culture, which all the great Marxists had. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, all of them. You read their writings on culture precisely, and on art even. Marvelous stuff. Trotsky, by the way, nobody could accuse him of being a dilettante, I think. In 1939, was it? Must have been, thereabouts. He formed an alliance with a French surrealist poet, André Breton, and they wrote a manifesto. They actually wrote a manifesto together. This is a few months before he was assassinated, by the way. He wrote a manifesto with André Breton for revolutionary art. The struggle for revolutionary art. You see, look, art nowadays is reduced to a miserable level under capitalism. Art becomes a commodity. Artists become a commodity if it comes to that. And true capitalism is innately hostile to art, really. Where, I ask myself, all these terrible tragedies in Gaza and so on and so forth, where is that? Where is that found a reflection in art? No. Instead of that, you have unmade beds. Sharks in formaldehyde. Now, what's that? I don't know. Unmade beds and unmade bed. Shark in formaldehyde is a shark in formaldehyde. Empty stuff of people too busy examining their own navels, their own personal problems and nonsense to pay attention to the real drama, the historical drama which is involving the whole of the human race. Comrades, that's not art. That's not art. True art will emerge. I'm sure there are many young artists and poets and writers who don't get a chance to produce under these systems. They will be released. Their energy will be released. And the achievement of the socialist revolution and communism will provide the basis for the greatest cultural revolution in the whole of human history. Comrades, that's what we're fighting for. We must fight to the end in order to achieve it.